Your grandmother knew what to do when you had a fever. She did not Google it. She did not call a doctor. She went to the kitchen or the garden or the cabinet where she kept the things her mother had taught her to keep. Chamomile for the stomach, willow bark for the pain, honey and garlic for the chest, ginger root steeped in hot water for the nausea, mustard plasters for the congestion. She had a remedy for everything, and most of the time it worked well enough. Not because she was a doctor, because she was the end point of a knowledge system that had been passed from mother to daughter for longer than any medical school has existed. That system is gone now. It was not abandoned, it was replaced, deliberately, systematically, and with the financial backing of the two wealthiest foundations in American history. Between 1870 and 1930, the United States went from a country where anyone could practice medicine to a country where healing without a license was a criminal act. In the span of a single lifetime, community healers became felons, midwives became suspects, herbalists became quacks, and the word doctor went from meaning someone who helps when you are sick to meaning someone the state has authorized to help when you are sick. This is the story of how that happened. And like everything else in this series, the answer involves money, institutional power, and a population that was never asked whether it preferred the system that replaced the one it lost. If this is the kind of history you never learned in school, subscribe. This channel exists to find it. I came to this through a phrase, practicing medicine without a license. It is a phrase Americans hear so often that it sounds natural, inevitable, like medicine has always required a license the way driving requires a license or selling alcohol requires a license. But that is not true. For most of American history, there was no such thing as a medical license. The concept did not exist. Anyone could call themselves a doctor. Anyone could treat the sick. And millions of Americans never saw a doctor at all because they did not need to. They had someone closer. In the colonial era, women were the primary healthcare providers in nearly every community in America. They were not called doctors. They were called healers, or granny women, or herb wives, or simply mothers. They delivered babies, they set bones, they treated fevers, infections, burns, coughs, rashes, and wounds. They knew which plants reduced swelling and which ones stopped bleeding and which ones eased a woman through labor. This knowledge was not written in textbooks. It was carried in memory, demonstrated by hand, refined over generations, and shared within networks of women who understood their local environment better than any physician trained in Edinburgh or Philadelphia ever could. Pioneer women heading west brought their family remedy books with them. They learned from Native American women which indigenous plants could replace the European herbs they had left behind. Appalachian women, known as yarb doctors, maintained pharmacopoeias drawn from centuries of accumulated observation, combining Scots-Irish folk traditions with Cherokee plant knowledge. In the Ozarks, domestic medicine was an almost exclusively feminine art. Mothers taught daughters to prepare poultices and tinctures the way they taught them to cook. Each generation refined what worked and discarded what did not. The remedies rarely cured the underlying disease, but they managed the symptoms that killed people. And in an era before antibiotics, that distinction was the difference between living and dying. These women were not marginal figures, they were the healthcare system. In 1800, there were fewer than 5,000 trained physicians in a country of over 5 million people. Most of those physicians were concentrated in cities along the eastern seaboard. For the vast majority of Americans living in rural areas, the nearest doctor was days away by horse. The local healer was next door, and her services did not cost anything because she practiced as a matter of community obligation, the same way a neighbor might help raise a barn. Here is what changed that. It did not happen all at once. It happened in 3 waves, each one building on the last, each one closing a door that had been open since the founding of the country. The first wave was political. In the early 1800s, some states had attempted to regulate medical practice by granting licensed physicians the exclusive right to collect fees. But these early laws were met with furious resistance. Americans in the Jacksonian era despised the idea that government could tell them who they were allowed to see for help. Samuel Thompson, a self-educated New England farmer, built a wildly popular herbal medical system in the 1810s and the 1820s based on the promise that ordinary people could treat themselves without relying on the bloody, mercury-dosing practitioners of mainstream medicine. His followers numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They successfully lobbied state after state to repeal medical licensing laws entirely. By 1850, hardly a state in the Union still regulated who could practice medicine. The marketplace was wide open. Herbalists, midwives, homeopaths, eclectics, bone setters, and trained physicians all competed for patients in a system where the patient decided who they trusted. That openness terrified the organized medical profession, and they spent the next 50 years closing it. In 1847, the American Medical Association was founded. Its stated purpose was to improve the standards of medical education and protect the public from unqualified practitioners. Its unstated purpose, acknowledged openly in its own proceedings, was to reduce competition. At the time, trained physicians competed in an open marketplace against homeopaths, herbalists, eclectics, midwives, bone setters, and any number of community healers who charged less and were often preferred by patients. The AMA's founding constitution was, in large part, a declaration of war against everyone who practiced medicine outside the boundaries that the AMA intended to draw. The first target was the medical marketplace itself. In 1870, no state in the country required a license to practice medicine. By 1900, almost every state and territory had passed some form of medical licensing law. The AMA and its state affiliates drafted model legislation, lobbied state legislatures, and staffed the licensing boards that would decide who could and could not practice. The physicians who wrote the exams were the same physicians who had graduated from the schools that the exams were designed to favor. To make the laws politically palatable, doctors packaged them with broader public health reforms, sanitation regulations, quarantine powers, and disease reporting. Licensing requirements rode in on the back of public health, and by the time anyone noticed, the door had closed. The effect was immediate and devastating. Eclectic physicians who blended herbal and mainstream approaches saw their schools shuttered one by one. Homeopathic physicians, who at their peak numbered over 14,000 with 22 medical schools, were gradually absorbed or eliminated. At the height of their independence, homeopaths treated a significant share of the American population. By 1920, most of their schools were closed, merged, or converted to conventional programs. The decision in 1903 by the American Medical Association to admit homeopaths into its membership, paradoxically, destroyed them. Once inside the American Medical Association system, their separate identity dissolved. As one historian put it, when homeopaths were shunned, they thrived. When they were included, they vanished. But the physicians were only the beginning. The real casualties were the people who had never attended any school at all. In California, the 1876 Anti-Quackery Act required anyone practicing medicine to present a diploma from a recognized medical school. Police and physicians collaborated to conduct sting operations against unlicensed healers. In San Francisco in 1883, a member of the medical society pretended to be sick, visited a Chinese herbalist named Zhou Gong, and when Gong could not produce a license, had him arrested on the spot. In San Bernardino in 1914, 3 pharmacy board inspectors disguised themselves, swept into town, and arrested 3 Chinese herbalists along with other unlicensed practitioners. Chinese physicians were doubly targeted. Their medical training came from Chinese institutions that American boards refused to recognize. Their herbal traditions, some stretching back thousands of years, were simply deemed illegal. In Appalachia, the process was slower but equally thorough. Between 1890 and 1930, settlement schools modeled on urban institutions arrived in rural communities. They brought nurses, physicians, and a specific ideology that scientific medicine should replace the folk practices of the mountain people. Women healers, the chief repositories of medical knowledge in the region, began to lose their status. The granny women who had delivered every baby in the hollow were replaced by physicians who called childbirth a pathological process requiring medical intervention. By 1920, the most influential obstetric textbook in America argued that normal delivery was so rare that every birth required a sequence of medical interventions: sedation at the onset of labor, ether during delivery, and surgical incision of the birth canal. A natural process that women had managed for millennia was reclassified as a medical emergency that only a licensed professional could supervise. In 1900, physicians attended roughly half of all births in America, and fewer than 5% happened in hospitals. By the early 1920s, half of all births occurred in hospitals. The midwife, who had been the center of maternal care for the entire history of the species, was pushed to the margins within a single generation. In some states, she was pushed out entirely. In mid-Atlantic cities, immigrant midwives from Europe were still attending 20 to 40% of births as late as 1920. In many cases, this meant they were practicing illegally, continuing traditions that had sustained their communities for centuries, now reclassified as criminal activity by licensing boards they had never been invited to join. The irony was that physicians were not necessarily better at delivering babies. Studies from the early 20th century repeatedly showed that midwife-attended births had lower rates of infection and maternal death than physician-attended births. The problem was not competence. The problem was authority. The medical profession wanted control over childbirth because childbirth was the single most common medical event in every community. Whoever controlled that event controlled the community's relationship to medicine itself. Once a woman went to the hospital to have her baby, she was inside the system, and the system did not let go. Then came the Flexner Report. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation published a study by Abraham Flexner titled Medical Education in the United States and Canada. Flexner was not a physician. He held a bachelor's degree in arts from Johns Hopkins, where he studied Greek and Latin. He had never practiced medicine, never treated a patient, and never attended medical school. The Carnegie Foundation hired him specifically because he was an outsider, which they believed would ensure objectivity. What it actually ensured was a man with no clinical experience making sweeping judgments about who should and shouldn't be allowed to heal. Flexner visited all 155 medical schools in North America and evaluated their facilities, curricula, and admission standards. His report was devastating. He described most schools as inadequate, many as beyond repair. He recommended that the number of medical schools be cut by more than half, that all surviving schools be attached to universities, and that the curriculum be rebuilt around laboratory science and hospital-based training. The model he championed was Johns Hopkins, the school whose campus he had once walked as an undergraduate. The Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations immediately poured money into the schools that met Flexner's standards and withdrew support from everything else. John D. Rockefeller's General Education Board donated hundreds of millions of dollars to reshape American medical education according to a single template. Schools that taught homeopathy, naturopathy, eclectic medicine, herbal medicine, and osteopathy were starved of funding, denied accreditation, and forced to close. In 1904, there were 160 medical schools in America with over 28,000 students. By 1920, there were 85. By 1935, there were 66. 80% of programs teaching alternative medical disciplines were eliminated. Of the 7 medical schools serving Black Americans, 5 were closed. Only Howard and Meharry survived. The already thin pipeline of Black physicians was nearly severed. To this day, over 80% of Black doctors in America were trained at one of those 2 schools. In 2008, nearly a century after the Flexner Report, the American Medical Association formally apologized for its history of racial inequality toward African American physicians. The apology did not undo the century of damage. Women's medical schools were decimated as well. Before Flexner, women had made significant gains in medical education. After Flexner, the number of women physicians collapsed and did not recover until after the Second World War. Harvard and Yale medical schools did not open their doors to women until the 1940s. Here is what I keep returning to. The Flexner Report is almost universally described as a reform, and it did undeniably, improved the scientific rigor of American medical education. The worst diploma, mills deserved to close. The charlatans, who sold colored water as medicine, deserved to be stopped. Nobody is arguing that a man who surgically implanted goat testicles into patients for impotence, which actually happened, should have been allowed to continue. But the reform did not merely eliminate fraud, it eliminated diversity. It replaced a medical ecosystem that included herbalists, midwives, homeopaths, eclectics, bone setters, and community healers with a single model: university-based, hospital-affiliated, pharmaceutical-oriented, and extraordinarily expensive. It replaced a system in which a woman in Appalachia could walk next door for help, with a system in which that same woman might have to drive 60 miles to reach a physician, if she could afford one at all. And the people who funded this transformation were not disinterested. John D. Rockefeller had a financial stake in pharmaceutical medicine. His General Education Board funded the schools that taught drug-based and surgical treatment. His Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research funded the research that produced the drugs. The same family that monopolized American oil through Standard Oil shaped the institutions that would monopolize American healthcare. The system that replaced your grandmother's remedies was designed, funded, and enforced by people who profited from the replacement. And the consequences of that consolidation did not stop in 1935. They compounded. Between 2013 and 2020, roughly 4% of America's rural hospitals closed. Between 1998 and 2021, nearly 1,900 hospital mergers were executed. Emergency medical care became harder to access in precisely the communities that had once relied on local healers. The physician shortage in rural America today is not a new crisis. It is the inevitable endpoint of a decision made over a century ago to concentrate medical authority in institutions that were never designed to serve people who lived far from cities. The granny woman was eliminated, and nothing replaced her. Meanwhile, the share of physicians working in private practice fell from 60% in 2012 to 47% by 2022. Medicine itself was being consolidated into larger and larger corporate systems. The individual doctor who knew your name, your family, and your history was being replaced by the same institutional logic that had replaced the individual healer a century before. The pattern did not stop. It accelerated. Consider what was lost. Willow bark contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin is derived. Foxglove contains digitalis, still used to treat heart conditions. Quinine, the most effective treatment for malaria for centuries, comes from the bark of the cinchona tree. Morphine comes from the opium poppy. Penicillin, the most transformative drug in human history, was derived from a mold that folk healers had unknowingly been using for centuries when they applied moldy bread to infected wounds. The pharmaceutical industry did not invent these remedies. It extracted them from the knowledge of the people it displaced, refined them into patentable compounds, and sold them back to the population at prices the original healers would have found obscene. The willow bark your grandmother peeled from a tree in her yard became a pill that costs money from a company that profits from your inability to peel the bark yourself. The knowledge was not lost because it stopped working. It was lost because it could not be monetized in its original form. There is a town in the mountains of eastern Kentucky where, as recently as the 1960s, elderly women still remembered the remedies their grandmothers had used. Researchers who interviewed them in the 1970s found pharmacopoeias of remarkable sophistication, blending Scots-Irish herbal traditions with Native American plant knowledge and generations of local refinement. The women spoke of these remedies in the past tense. They knew the recipes, but their daughters did not, because their daughters had been taught that those remedies were superstition, that real medicine came from a doctor, and that the knowledge their mothers carried was embarrassing rather than valuable. It was the same decade that replaced local time with a railroad time. It was the same era that replaced community identity with census records. It was the same generation that replaced community policing with professional departments and local food knowledge with federal regulation and home addresses with government-assigned numbers. And now the same pattern replaced the healer next door with a licensed physician 60 miles away, and a pharmacy that charges $9 for a bottle of processed willow bark. The pattern always moves in one direction, from local to central, from free to expensive, from community knowledge to institutional gatekeeping, from a system that required you to know your neighbors to a system that requires you to know your insurance provider. Your grandmother's remedies did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they could not be licensed, standardized, patented, or sold. And the institutions that replaced them have spent a century making sure you believe they were never worth keeping. If you've made it this far, you already see the pattern. Subscribe, because the next one goes deeper.